What happened to Laura Sampaio? In a city where honor held the force of law and silence could be bought with a look, one missing woman would peel back a century of protection and secrecy. Dawn in Niterói. That March of 1900 felt like a borrowed thing. The lamps along the lanes had not yet surrendered their smoke to the gray light. Waves lapped a distance away, steady and indifferent. Inside a townhouse not far from the bay, breakfast lay untouched. A single perfume bottle, its stopper off, lay on a linen handkerchief with a faint spill of scent still staining the cloth. The bed in the whitewashed room had been made with care. The wardrobe closed. There was no trace of violence. There was no Laura. If you want to know what follows, you must first understand the world she lived in. Niterói then was a city of narrow reputations and wide facades, porticos and drawing rooms, parades of propriety, and a social order that prized family name above the fragile life of an unmarried daughter. For women of Laura's class, the options were limited: marriage that preserved honor, cloistered devotion, or the slow, quiet erasure of a woman whose desires did not fit a patriarch's script. This is not the story of a sensational disappearance reduced to a caricature. It is an archival reconstruction of a life that was recorded in small things: a diary hidden in an attic chest, a silver locket with the initials LS, a perfume bottle sealed in paper, and later kept as if it were a relic. Those objects would speak when most people around them were bent on silence. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel and follow this series on historical investigations. There are more pieces of Laura's life we will unpack as we go. The Sampaio household was, by the standards of the day, solidly respectable. Eduardo Sampaio was a man who had established himself in commerce and social circles, stern, exacting, the sort of patriarch whose decisions were taken as natural law. Helena, his wife, moved through the house with the frail grace of someone uneasy in the world. Contemporaneous accounts and household notes indicate a woman who slept heavily, prone to long periods of lethargy, frequently dosed with laudanum or other sedatives administered as care. Laura, the couple's only daughter who had reached 22, was described by neighbors as devout and gentle. She attended Mass, played the piano in afternoons, and wore a quietness that the town took for piety. Yet beneath that quiet was a restlessness hinted at in the few intimate confidences she left behind. Servants came and went in the Sampaio home, people whose names rarely survived official files, but whose memories would later become crucial. Among them, Maria das Dores, the longtime governess who kept a ledger of the household and later retained a few cherished objects, and at a later time, Teresa Oliveira, a servant who would stumble on a secret that shifted the case from a missing person puzzle to something darker. For now, though, on that March morning, the immediate witness was the woman who managed the day-to-day domestic orders. No one found Laura. Her father did not call the police at once. The house settled into a pall of polite questions. When Eduardo finally reported his daughter missing, hours later, according to the municipal records, the initial police response was brisk, but cursory. A small patrol visited the house, took notes, and filed a brief report that would later be criticized as perfunctory. The officer's page in the archive is a single paragraph. The bed made, no sign of forced entry, last seen at dusk by a servant. The report closes with a line that would sting historians decades later: no immediate indication of crime. That sentence, written in ink and a hurry, is also an invitation to forget. There were oddities. The perfume bottle caught an officer's eye because it was not a common brand, and because the stopper's absence suggested haste or ritual. A silk handkerchief bore faint impressions of a pressed photograph. Laura's room had been left pristine, down to the needlework folded on her table. The wardrobe held the outfits she favored, conservative dresses in muted colors. No letters lay in plain sight. No luggage suggested escape. But absence of evidence is not always evidence of innocence. The people closest to Laura knew more than the first report let on. Outside official channels, a small paper trail began to form precisely because someone could not leave the matter alone. The earliest and most consequential thread of that paper trail involved a chest hidden in an attic and the diary inside it. The chest came to light months after the disappearance, not by a curious investigator, but by a servant named Teresa Oliveira. Teresa had been employed in the Sampaio household for only a short time, but she had access to places others did not. One afternoon, while cleaning and rearranging trunks, she opened a crate in an upper room and found a metal box, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were letters, a perfume bottle carefully wrapped, a small silver locket engraved with the initials LS, and, folded between the pages of a prayer book, Laura's diary. Teresa did not keep the discovery to herself. She took the box home to her brother, Antonio. The siblings read the diary together by lamplight, in the cramped kitchen of their own modest dwelling. In those pages they found something the formal police had missed or chosen to ignore, a chronicle of confinement and fear, written in a precise, almost formal hand, the kind taught in good homes. The diary's tone shifted from dutiful observations of prayer and needlework to a series of swift, urgent notes that suggested surveillance and coercion. An entry dated days before the disappearance reads, in translation of the archival copy, simply, "Tomorrow, before dawn, I will try to run away. It is my only chance." That sentence, when read aloud in a room far from the Sampaio drawing room, had the force of a confession and a plea. The diary contains passages that are emphatic in what they do not say. Laura rarely names the people who made her frightened. She seldom writes accusations with certainty, but she writes in oblique, damning detail about nights when she was watched, about windows kept shuttered against the street, about conversations overheard and then denied. "He speaks to me as if I belong to him," one entry records. "I have no private hour." Those lines, brief and unadorned, suggest a household in which a daughter's personhood was not fully recognized. Teresa and Antonio faced a choice. To take the diary to the authorities would mean placing the truth in the hands of the very institutions that had not bothered to pry. Instead, they sought the church. They took the box to Padre Mateus, the parish priest, a man known in the neighborhood for his quiet counsel and his willingness to receive confidences outside official scrutiny. The idea was not unusual. For many in that era, the parish offered a parallel authority, a place to plead for mercy without the risk of immediate retribution. It is at this juncture that the first of several silences deepened into something more sinister. Padre Mateus did receive the diary, and, by several accounts corroborated in parish notes and letters kept in private hands, he agreed to intervene discreetly. He read the passages, took careful notes, and promised to confront the family or to intercede with ecclesiastical channels. His intentions are documented in a short handwritten notation. Complaint received, to speak with the Sampaio family. That note, an archival slip now faded, marks the church as the first authority to be explicitly engaged. But before Father Mateus could act in any meaningful way, he died. The official cause, recorded in a parish ledger, was a sudden illness. Word in the community, however, took on a different hue. The priest's death, coming so soon after he read the diary, would become a staple of the case's oral history. Those who memorialized the event later would note the coincidence with a gravity that felt like accusation. A man who promised to speak for a missing woman was himself silenced. Whether his death was natural or not is something the records do not, and perhaps cannot, definitively say. What they do show is a chain of events in which actors who sought to reveal the truth were neutralized, intimidated, or displaced. In the press, early attempts to bring Laura's story into public conversation were stifled. A reporter named Carlos Drummond, sometimes spelled Drummond or Drumold in differing copies of the files, tried to write about the apparent oddities. Drummond was a young man, a typographer by training, who had a reputation for poking into matters others preferred to leave buried. His early copy, a short piece that read more like an inquiry than an exposé, was cut by his newspaper's editor. The editor, a proprietor with ties to the city's elite, was reluctant to antagonize families whose influence could mean the difference between profit and loss. Drummond would later recall in notes preserved among his papers that his editor refused to print anything that would sully a name. The page with Drumann's original draft, now a fragment among folders of correspondence, ends with the journalist's admonition. There are forces at work here that prefer secrecy. Those forces included not only social pressure but institutional arrangements that, in the early years of the 20th century, protected private interests. Among them was a private sanatorium on the outskirts of the region known as Retiro da Paz. Managed by Dr. Augusto Mendonça, the institution marketed itself as a retreat for those in need of rest and moral repair. In practice, private sanatoria of that era were places where inconvenient women and men could be removed from public scrutiny, sometimes at the request of family, sometimes in the name of treatment. Retiro da Paz would later appear in letters and patient lists under alternate names, Luciana Santos among them, which suggested deliberate obfuscation in patient admissions. We must be careful here. What appears in ledger entries and correspondence are names and dates. The leap from a falsified admission to a criminal act requires evidence beyond an alias. Still, the pattern is striking when viewed across documents. Admissions with minimal identifying details, transfers labeled as "for treatment in Europe," and a secluded reserved ward noted in a doctor's shorthand. These are the types of records that, when read together, point to a system that could hide a person in plain sight. Against the grain of institutional inertia, some individuals tried to give voice to Laura's account. Maria das Dores, the governess who remained attached to the family's material life, kept a ledger and a few items that later surfaced among an estate's belongings. She preserved a small list of names, those who visited the house at unusual hours, those who delivered potions and medicines, those who called the family by intimate titles in the dead of night. Her notes are sparse, practical, dates, times, initials. Yet those dry pages, when read alongside the diary's emotional urgency, draw a picture of a household under a watchful, often controlling gaze. The immediate aftermath of the disappearance thus devolved into a battlefield of silences. Some people left town or were nudged out. Teresa and her brother were among those who found themselves on the margins, ostracized for their possession of the diary, wary of conversations that might invite retaliation. A typographer found his job insecure. The parish lost a priest who might have intervened. A reporter stopped writing. The municipal file grew dusty. And yet, truths have a way of insisting. Paper survives in attics and in private drawers. Objects become evidence by virtue of being preserved. The silver locket with LS, wrapped in oilcloth and kept by a servant who would not speak openly, would be one such survivor. In the locket, later inventory lists show, there was a lock of hair and a small portrait, fragments of a life that a century would try to forget. If we stop here, the record reads like a series of absences. A missing woman, a silent father, a dead priest, a paper trail that gathers like dust. But in the margins of the municipal and parish archives, in correspondence tucked into private papers, there are other traces. Hints that the disappearance did not end with the first report. That is where the larger story begins. In the choices people made to protect reputations, in the small acts of preservation by those who dared to remember, and in the documents that would quietly persist until someone else decided to look again. The day Teresa and Antonio put the diary in Padre Mateus's hands, they believed they were entering a moral register, confession, counsel, church arbitration. They did not imagine that the registers of power, the family's influence, the physician's discretion, the press's restraint, would conspire to reroute their desperate plea into a silence so thick it would take decades to pierce. They did not know that a private clinic named Retiro da Paz would become a waypoint in a bureaucratic maze. They did not know that the bottle of perfume and the silver locket would be all that remained in public memory for a long time. Local gossip swelled into narrative. At the market and in the tramcars, people calculated the odds. Had Laura run away? Had she been taken to a convent? Had she been married off in secret? Those were kinder interpretations, the sort a town willing to preserve a family name might prefer. Others, grimmer and quieter, whispered about coercion, the diary's language, the priest's abrupt death, the stifled reporting combined into an outline that refused to be cheery. It was in those whispers that the first conspiratorial strains took root, not as an accusation laying crime to anyone's door, but as an accusation laid against a system that allowed a woman's life to be managed as a problem to be fixed. What the immediate archives show is patchy but telling. Municipal notes, parish ledgers, private letters, each alone tells a part of the story. Together they suggest an apparatus that moved to conceal rather than to clarify. There are ledger entries indicating the delivery of medicines to the Sampaio house on specific nights, signed by Dr. Mendonça. There is a brief receipt in the sanatorium register, listing an admission under the name Luciana Santos. The register entry is terse. Age approximate, origin, Niterói, location within the sanatorium, reserved. At the foot of that same page, a notation reads, patient transferred. When historians first collated these items, their impulse was to read across documents and infer practice. The use of aliases, polite transfers offshore, reserved wards where visibility was minimal. Each inference had to be couched carefully. None constituted direct proof of an intentional disappearance orchestrated by a family. Still, to understand why so many preferred silence, one must imagine the stakes. Eduardo Sampaio's position in society was not trivial. Reputation here translated into access to brokered marriages, contracts, and the kind of friends who could dissuade a paper from printing an embarrassing story. The calculus of reputation often outweighed the moral clarity of confronting wrongdoing. For those who saw what they thought they saw, servants, a few friends, a sympathetic journalist, speaking out meant risking a livelihood or worse. The diary, in this sense, was an act of defiance. Its very existence challenged the idea that a family name could erase a person. Within weeks of the disappearance, the case quieted in official channels. Yet the diary's existence ensured it could not be forgotten by everyone. Secretly kept letters and objects passed from hand to hand, some hidden in trunks, others placed with trusted neighbors. Teresa, who had fled the house in fear months after delivering the diary, carried the perfume bottle and the locket as if to hold on to a piece of Laura's truth. Antonio, who read Laura's words by lamplight, kept a copy of the diary pages in his trunk. Their small acts of preservation would prove decisive much later. The Sampaio family publicly maintained a posture of decorum. Eduardo issued brief statements through intermediaries that insisted on privacy and charity. Friends circulated explanations that Laura had left to visit a distant relative. Others murmured of a convent. None of these narratives bore documentation. What remained were artifacts: the perfume bottle, the silver locket, the diary fragment. Later scholars would point to them as the physical evidence that memory, even when oppressed, can resist erasure. There is one archival moment that demonstrates the way in which memory can be obscured by power. A municipal clerk's note, written the day the initial police report was filed, includes the phrase, "Investigations should be limited to what is necessary. Consider the family's position." It is a small bureaucratic sentence, but it speaks volumes about priorities. At the time, such a directive would have been not merely advice, but instruction of practice. Do not pursue matters that might imperil social order. By the end of that first year, the disappearance had seeped into two kinds of history: the formal record of a municipal file that declared the matter unresolved, and the oral memory of a neighborhood that hosted rumors and small secret remembrances. Between those two memories sat the instruments of power: newspapers that would not publish, a medical establishment with motives of discretion, and a patriarchal family that could assert influence. The diary was a fissure in that architecture, and yet fissures widen. The removal of the diary from the house to the church, the priest's death, a reporter silenced. Each of those events formed a pattern. It was a pattern of dampening, not proof of a particular crime. But patterns, over decades, accumulate weight. In later years, when other documents surfaced, historians would read those early signs, not as isolated events, but as the first links of a long chain. For now, in this moment at the beginning of the 20th century, a young woman's voice had been preserved on paper and in the hands of people willing to risk social censure. Whether that voice would find an audience strong enough to overcome influence remained to be seen. The next steps of this story, how the diary would resurface decades later, how a sanatorium's records would be interrogated, and how an exhumation would produce the sort of forensic detail that archives rarely yield, are matters for later chapters. But there was one more immediate and dramatic consequence of the diary's circulation. It made enemies of those who preferred that the past remain controlled. A typographer lost his position. A servant found herself made uncomfortable in the town's gossip networks. A priest was gone. Those are the on-the-ground consequences that mark a society's response to truth. Before leaving 1900, it is important to pause on the image the Sampaio household left to the city. A tidy room with a made bed, a handkerchief with a faint scent, a silver locket hidden away. Those objects would endure. They would be evidence of a life interrupted, and they would become the means by which later investigators would insist that Laura's absence was not a simple vanishing into anonymity. Objects, after all, are stubborn witnesses. They do not plead, but they persist. As spring became summer, streets in Niterói took on their season. The town moved on in visible ways. Markets continued, church bells tolled, young men and women married. But in the shadows, people kept the diary's memory alive. Teresa left town not long after her meeting with the parish. Antonio found work 2 towns over. Drummond's columns became sporadic and then silent. The municipal file closed its early notes with no resolution. The Sampaio house resumed its public life with the calm of an institution that had weathered an awkward gust. This first period, the disappearance, the perfunctory police report, the discovery of the diary, the church's brief intervention, the priest's death, and the shuttering of early public inquiry, forms the prologue of a longer, darker story. It is the moment when a private household's choices and a society's tolerance for discretion combine to obscure a life that, by all surviving clues, was constrained and anxious. The diary's pages had been read and then hidden. The locket had been wrapped and safeguarded. Silence had been brokered in whispers and in instructions written in municipal hand. Decades later, these traces would be enough to convince a new investigator to open the files and to search where earlier hands had chosen not to pry. But for those first months after Laura's disappearance, the balance of power favored concealment. For every person who tried to give Laura a voice, there were others who preferred the economy of a quiet scandal rather than the social cost of exposure. In the months that followed, the archive thickened with materials that, at the time, must have looked like ordinary paperwork. Receipts signed by a sanatorium doctor, sparse notations about reserved sessions, a ledger entry under an assumed name. The language in these entries is clinical, bureaucratic. It says only what it must: admissions, transfers, dates. But even bureaucracy can be a tool of concealment. When the man who oversaw one private clinic could list a patient as Luciana Santos and note her transfer to a reserved ward, he exercised discretion on 2 counts, about identity and about location. That very discretion would later make investigators' work both easier and harder. Easier because records, however euphemistic, existed. Harder because those records had been shaped to protect reputations. We end this segment of Laura's story with the diary's most urgent plea, and a question that will follow the rest of the narrative. Words on a page were never meant to stand alone. They demand witnesses. Laura left a witness, the pages themselves, and those pages were given to others. Those others were silenced, displaced, or disbelieved. Whether the diary would eventually find the ears and instruments necessary to translate its anguish into official truth was uncertain. But the fact that the diary survived would, in time, prove to be the pivot upon which the case turned. In the next stages of this story, we will follow the paper trail from the private sanatorium's ledger to the physical remnants that would later be exhumed. We will return to the men and women who tried, and failed, to make the town hear. And we will track how, decades on, The artifacts, kept in trunks and boxes, would force a reopening of what many had wished forgotten. For now, the early months of 1900 close with a house that appears outwardly untroubled. A parish ledger with a single line about a complaint received, and a small iron box hidden in an attic that contained a voice no one dared to publish. The immediate silence around Laura's disappearance had been achieved, but the survival of those objects ensured that silence would not be final. Months became years, and the small objects that refused to be forgotten began to travel their own stubborn route through time. The perfume bottle stayed wrapped in oilcloth. The silver locket with the initials LS passed from hand to hand. The diary's pages were copied and concealed. These were not dramatic gestures in a courtroom or on the front page of a newspaper. They were low, private acts of preservation, stashings, whispers, furtive readings by candlelight that kept a record alive when authority would not. The next significant trace in the paper trail leads us into correspondence between the Sampaio household and a man whose name would come to occupy a dark corner of the story, Dr. Augusto Mendonça, director of Retiro da Paz. The surviving letters are brief, formal, and often euphemistic. One reads like a negotiation of convenience, a request for a discreet session, and a note indicating that a patient would be admitted under a name other than her own. The sanatorium's ledger, dry, clinical, and in a hand different from the Sampaio household correspondence, carries a single entry that would later loom large for historians. Luciana Santos, origin Niterói, ward reserved, admission, March, age approx. 22. At the foot of the page, in the shorthand of administrators who wish to say as little as possible, a final line appears, patient transferred. We cannot know from that ledger alone what fate befell the young woman recorded as Luciana Santos. The entry is a bureaucratic artifact. It is not a verdict. Yet read against the diary's urgency and the other traces, delivered medicines on certain nights, hurried ledger signatures, a house that would not speak for its daughter. The ledger becomes part of a pattern. Archivists and later investigators would treat the ledger as a node, a place where a private name was swapped for an institutional identity, where a person might be rendered less visible by a routine act of admission. Resistance to public reckoning did not end with ledger entries. The social and professional costs of dissent continued to push against those who sought to be honest. Newspaper files show that Carlos Drummond persisted in his interest. In 1932, years after the disappearance, Drummond returned to the subject in a series of notes and inquiries collected among his papers. He tried again to bring attention to the story, to assemble the fragments that time had kept. His employer, however, remained wary. Drummond's drafts show that he believed a pattern of concealment had taken place. His editor's marginalia, blunt and businesslike, cautioned that stories implicating respected families would harm the paper's interests. Drummond's investigation would be intermittent and, in the public record, ultimately muted. Still, his preserved notes would later be useful to those who wanted to follow the threads left cold for decades. Not all delegations to official authority were fruitless. There were, scattered through private letters and estate inventories, testimonies from people who had worked inside Retiro da Paz or who had witnessed the comings and goings at odd hours. One such witness was Sebastião Pereira, who, years after the events, would testify to the circumstances of a late-night removal from a private residence. According to a sworn statement later filed in an investigating delegate's archive, Sebastião recalled being asked to accompany a stretcher at midnight and to sign a casual receipt for a patient who was to be transferred for treatment abroad. In his testimony, he would say, plainly quoted in the record, "They took her at midnight. I saw a woman laid on the stretcher, pale, covered." The phrase is brief and offered as recollection. It is not, in itself, a legal finding. But combined with other artifacts, an admission under a false name, the sudden absence of a woman from her home, the priest's death, the statement becomes another element in a growing mosaic. Teresa's flight had ripple effects. Ostracized and fearful for her safety, she became one of the many who stepped away from a town that preferred not to ask questions. Antonio, who had read Laura's diary, was forced to change employers and to live with the caution of someone who knew too much. Maria das Dores aged into a figure of quiet defiance, keeping a ledger and a list of deliveries that would later be catalogued among estate papers. None of these actions amounted to the sort of public inquiry that could produce a judicial reckoning. But they preserved pieces of truth in ways that official channels had not. When the world seems to have finished with a story, archives sometimes have other plans. In 1965, 65 years after Laura's disappearance, a new delegate, Arnaldo Carvalho, opened a file that had been left dormant. The official impetus came from a mix of bureaucratic housekeeping and curious persistence. Files were being reviewed, boxes inventoried. Someone noticed a packet of notes, a pressed page, a small list of artifacts with curious initials. Among these materials was a small cardboard box that had, for reasons never fully explained in the municipal inventory, been set aside decades earlier and later given to a clerical transfer. Inside that box were items whose provenance bound this new inquiry to the past: the wrapped perfume bottle, the silver locket engraved with LS, and a page from the diary with one line underlined. The page instructed, "Search the basement." This was not an order from a magistrate. It was, according to later accounts, a fragment of a private plea. But for Arnaldo Carvalho, a man who had long read municipal files and who disliked half-stories, it was enough. He obtained permission to inspect the Sampaio house, and in an operation described later in his report, descended into a basement that had been altered and replastered over the years. Workers scraped, pried, and lifted boards. In a dark corner, they found a rusted metal box, sealed and heavy. Inside were letters, some in the Sampaio patriarch's hand, others in the neat hand of Dr. Mendonça, an inventory list, and the silver locket that matched the one catalogued in estate notes. The letters showed arrangements and nomenclature that suggested coordination between a family intent on discretion and a medical director who could provide physical removal from public view. One fragment of correspondence contains the phrase, tersely recorded, "Reserved ward for Luciana Santos confirmed." It is not a confession. It is a paper's admission of administrative discretion. Arnaldo Carvalho's decision to pursue the trace to its terminus would change the arc of the case. He petitioned for an exhumation at the cemetery maintained by Retiro da Paz, a place whose headstones were modest, whose records had been kept with varying degrees of care, and whose grounds were, by then, rumored among locals to hold unnamed graves. The sanatorium's cemetery plan indicated multiple anonymous burials, and one ledger entry, dreary, bureaucratic, listed a burial without a name, a simple date, and a notation that read, "Patient." Carvalho secured the warrant and organized an exhumation with forensic assistance. The forensic report is brief, clinical, and careful in its conclusions. Precisely the form of speech we want when dealing with what must remain a reconstruction rather than a verdict. The exhumed remains were those of a young woman, estimated biologically to be in her early 20s. The skeleton bore evidence of healed and recent conditions. Most materially significant was a fracture to the occipital region of the cranium. The forensic summary states, plainly, the cranium presented blunt force trauma to the occipital region consistent with a lethal blow. The line is disturbing because it is careful. It reports an anatomical observation, not a legal assignment of guilt. Clothing fragments, remnants of a dress, lace tracing, a button, were preserved. Inside the collar was the trace of fabric consistent with the period of Laura's last known clothing. Most archaeologically resonant was the finding of a small silver locket, dented but intact, and inside the locket, a lock of hair and a small photograph, both of which matched catalogue descriptions of the LS locket described in earlier inventories. The convergence of the locket, the diary's narrative, the sanatorium ledger entry, and the forensic finding produced a cumulative weight. Each item separately might have been read as coincidence. Together, they suggested something graver than mere disappearance. Historians and investigators would thereafter describe the exhumation as the moment when a case of social silence became a case of physical evidence. It is important, again, to underscore the limits of what those findings proved. Forensic reporting identified trauma. It did not name a perpetrator. Documents suggested a transfer, a reserved ward, an alias. They did not certify a conspiracy. The exhumed identification remained circumstantial. The personal effects and forensic profile were consistent with Laura Sampaio's known attributes, but the standard of modern forensic certainty, DNA testing, chain of custody controls at every turn, was not available in the same form for all the surviving materials. What the investigators had was a reconstruction grounded in tangible artifacts and testimony accumulated across decades. The municipal press, which had once been hesitant to probe, now faced a changed climate. An exhumation with a forensic finding was a story that could not be easily dismissed as rumor. Coverage in 1965 and 1966 carried a different tone, grave, corrective, seeking accountability. The paper that had once silenced Drummond published reports describing the exhumation and quoting the forensic report. Retired journalists dug through their old notes. Carlos Drummond, who by then was an older man with a stack of unpublished manuscripts, saw the narrative he had tried to pursue half a century earlier re-emerge in public light. The story was no longer merely about a missing woman. It had the tragic clarity of a body returned to speech through the language of the laboratory. Confronted with those facts, authorities took steps that had earthier consequences. In 1966, after legal formalities and the completion of documentation, the young woman's remains were reburied in a municipal plot with a modest marker. A small ceremony was held. It was not a public state funeral, but it had a dignity that the original disappearance had been denied. Family members of the Sampaio household did not attend in force. A handful of former servants, then elderly, and a handful of locals who had kept the story alive were present. The new grave carried, at the request of those who had preserved the locket and diary, the initials LS, with a hopeful note that the woman might at last be remembered. There was another human consequence to the decades-long arc. The story of Maria Orphan, the child whose initials would later link her to Laura's name. Maria's case is delicate. She was left as an infant and took the surname Orphan when she was found abandoned near a church. Local memory associated her with the Sampaio household because of the initials embroidered on a tiny shirt, and because people who remembered Laura said the infant's eyes resembled photographs of the young woman. The evidence that Maria was Laura's daughter is fragmentary. An item with LS initials, hearsay from aging servants, and a pattern of coincidences. Biographers and investigators who studied the case present Maria's possible connection as plausible, not proven. She grew up without the protection of the Sampaio name, and later left the region. Her life, like Laura's, folded into less visible histories. Maria's later life is a reminder that the consequences of secrecy and abuse are not contained in a single moment. They ripple outward into lives that never had a chance to tell their own stories. Debates followed the exhumation. Some worried that the late scrutiny could not deliver justice. The men who might have been responsible were dead. Documents that could point more clearly to motive or direct action were missing or destroyed. Records had been shaped by the very discretion the Sampaio family had exercised. Others insisted that the exhumation and reburial were moral acts, recognition, if belated, that an individual had been wronged by systems that prioritized reputation over life. The cultural afterlife of the case is itself instructive. Museum curators in Niterói catalogued the locket and the perfume bottle, noting provenance and the path by which the objects had been preserved. Local historians collected testimonies. Parish archives, reproductions were made and stored. The young woman's story, of a diary, a locket, a false name in a sanatorium register, entered a municipal memory that sought to reconcile respectability with culpability. In neighborhoods near the old Retiro da Paz, the ruins of the clinic and the cemetery where the anonymous graves once lay acquired a melancholic aura. People told stories, careful, sometimes whispered, about a woman who had been hidden in plain sight. Those stories sometimes became tinged with supernatural language, ghosts at the ruins, a candle that would not die. But official historians and archivists treated such anecdotes as cultural reflection, not evidence. Perhaps the most significant legacy is an ethical one. The Sampaio case forced local institutions to reconsider how they had balanced social interest and moral duty. The municipal file that once contained the phrase, "investigation should be limited to what is necessary," became, in later municipal reform debates, an example of the kinds of directives that have no place when lives are at stake. In the decades after the reburial, advocates for better archival access and for protections of vulnerable persons in private care used the case as a cautionary tale. The story's retelling in public forums demanded a new posture from newspapers, police, and medical institutions. More transparency, better record-keeping, and a skepticism toward institutional secrecy that could protect abusers. And yet the question at the heart of the matter persists. What happened to Laura Sampaio? The archival record, now richer thanks to the diary, the letters, the sanatorium ledger, Sebastião's testimony, Drummond's notes, and the exhumation report, allows us to answer in a way that is careful and humane. The cumulative evidence indicates that Laura was removed from her home and admitted to Retiro da Paz under a false name, that she died and was buried as an unnamed patient, and that medical and social discretion, allied with a family's interest in reputation, contributed to a decades-long silence. The language historians use must always be precise. Archival records indicate admission under an alias. Forensic examination shows cranial trauma consistent with homicide. Circumstantial and documentary evidence points to institutional concealment. Taken together, these elements form a plausible reconstruction of events that led to her death and to the suppression of public scrutiny. The reconstruction is not a trial. It does not pronounce guilt in the legal sense. Rather, it offers a morally persuasive narrative. A young woman's voice, preserved in a diary, and in the few objects clutched by those who refused to let memory vanish, was systematically silenced by social forces and institutional practices that privileged reputation over accountability. That is the story we can tell with the materials left to us. There remains, beyond the archive, the human residue of loss. The bed that was made, the handkerchief stained with perfume, the little knot of hair in a locket. These are the intimate artifacts that anchor history to a person. The reburial in 1966 did not deliver legal retribution, but it did perform another necessary function. It acknowledged a life and restored a name to the public register. The locket and the diary were given to museum care, the story entered local historiography, and the memory of Laura Sampaio became a lesson about the costs of silence. What do we owe such a life now? We owe honesty about the limits of what we can prove. We owe compassion for the people whose names became marginal in the unfolding, Teresa and Antonio, who preserved the diary at great personal cost, Maria das Dores, whose ledger offered dates and names, Sebastião, whose testimony provided an eyewitness fragment, Carlos Drummond, whose persistence, even when stymied, kept the question alive. We owe careful reading of documents and an insistence that institutional privilege should not inoculate wrongdoing from inquiry. And we owe, perhaps above all, remembrance. The Sampaio case for the city of Niterói and for those who study it has another lesson about memory. Objects survive when stories are fragile. The perfume bottle and the silver locket did not argue in court. They only remained. But in remaining, they made a claim on the future. They demanded that someone listen. The exhumation confirmed what those objects intimated. The diary made that confirmation human. The gravestone with LS is not a legal victory. It is a marker that a town can choose to recognize the past and the harm done. When history asks us to account for the wrongs of earlier ages, silence is rarely an innocent choice. It is typically an act with consequences. The archival evidence in Laura Sampaio's case points to a network of discretion, family decisions, a doctor's willingness to obscure identity, press restraint, that together produced a long period of enforced forgetting. That forgetfulness cost a life dignity and delayed truth. The work of reconstruction, when done with careful sourcing and ethical restraint, is an attempt to correct the balance. We end where this story began, with a question that still presses, even after the exhumation, reburial, and museum cataloging. Asking, "What happened to Laura Sampaio?" is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity. It is an ethical insistence that the dead deserve to be seen and that the living must be vigilant about systems that hide the vulnerable. The records we have, diary entries, letters, ledgers, testimony, and a forensic report, allow us to say that Laura's disappearance was not an ordinary vanishing. The safest reading of the available materials is that she was removed from her home and placed in an institutional context under an assumed name, where she died of blunt force trauma and was buried anonymously. Institutional discretion and social power delayed acknowledgement for decades. There are, of course, loose ends. Names are spelled differently across files. Some documents were likely lost to fire or private disposal. The full chain of decisions that led to Laura's death may never be reconstructed to the satisfaction of legal exactitude. But the human arc, the voice in the diary, the hands that wrapped the locket, the servant who fled in fear, the delegate who refused to let the file remain closed, remains clear. Memory persisted where power wished it otherwise. If this account prompts questions or recollections among viewers, the archival sources and museum collections listed in the description contain a map to the documents cited here: the municipal police archives, the parish ledgers where Father Mateus's notation appears, the Retiro da Paz register with its entry for Luciana Santos, the letters catalogued among the Sampaio estate papers, and the forensic report filed under Delegate Arnaldo Carvalho's case number. Responsible research can always deepen the public's understanding. Respectful sharing of family memories can help communities reckon with their pasts. What happened to Laura Sampaio was not an isolated misfortune. It was, by the archival record, the result of social priorities that valued reputation over a woman's autonomy and safety. Her story asks us to consider how many other lives might have been similarly shaped by discretion and silence. Remembering her is a small corrective, an insistence that memory must sometimes be coaxed from the places where it has been deliberately concealed. If this history resonated with you, we have linked the principal sources in the description: archival inventories, a museum catalog of the locket and perfume bottle, and the published fragments of Carlos Drummond's notes. If you carry family stories or knowledge that could weigh on this case, share them in a respectful comment or reach out to the municipal archives. Preservation of memory is a collective act. There are, in the quiet towns near the old sanatorium, people who still mention Laura in the same breath they use to warn a child to mind their step. That mingling of caution and remembrance is perhaps the most enduring afterlife of this case. A community learning, slowly and imperfectly, that a life matters not because it was prominent, but because it was lived. The perfume scent might have faded from a handkerchief long ago, but the locket's initials remain a small, stubborn witness. For Laura Sampaio, whose name we must now pronounce aloud, memory has at last been returned. Whether justice has been served in a legal sense is a separate matter. What we can say with confidence is this: a network of silence attempted to erase a life. The persistence of objects and the courage of a few kept her story from perishing entirely. That, in itself, is a kind of restitution.